are frustrated, but we've created the conditions that we're going to get frustrated in. Instead of saying like, why am I so mad? To get curious and say, what expectation just got violated? It's
how to have a toolkit to consistently deploy that thinking.
You stop and you say, what in life is causing you a lot of frustration or anger? You need to change it, you need to accept it, or you need to leave it. Entrepreneurship is inherently stressful. There are a lot of moving parts with high stakes involved. And recently we got a lot of response to our 3 Quick Ideas newsletter about anger and frustration. So aside from talking about concepts, today's episode, I want to have it more like a workshop where you can actually gain certain tools that you can immediately implement to feel less frustration and less anger while you're dealing in this challenging environment of entrepreneurship and life in general. So on that note, Alex, welcome to the pod, man. Any thoughts before we get going?
Thank you, Itamar. No thoughts. I'm an ocean of calm, and I look forward to understanding more of these human emotions, which I'm not aware of.
These other people. So on that note, the reality is that we all get frustrated, we all get angry sometimes if we're in the arena. Like, you could, in theory, go away into seclusion, be a monk, and that is one way to avoid emotional difficulty. However, if you actually want to accomplish something, you can't do that. You actually have to be in that arena. You're going to have some friction. You're going to have some challenges. And these are things that are going to get brought up. Certain feelings of anger or frustration. Now, the big thing with this is to recognize that just because these things pop up, it doesn't mean they have to drive your behavior. Okay? That's what a child instinctively does. You, as an adult, do not have to. Now, the first tool I want to talk about is just seeing anger or frustration as an expectation alarm. So just simply stop. Instead of saying, like a child, he's just angry, he's going to react, you can stop and say, you know what? Maybe this is just me not having a certain expectation of mine be met. Something isn't matching up to the reality I hoped would be, or I wanted it to be. And that reframing of just instead of asking yourself, instead of saying, I'm so mad, to being curious and saying, what expectation just got violated? It's causing this. It can shift the whole dynamic. Because again, all of a sudden, instead of just a child who's frustrated and saying, I'm so mad, or why am I so mad? You can be a curious adult who's trying to figure out what expectation of mine got violated or didn't get addressed, and therefore it's causing an internal frustration. Any thoughts on that, Les, before we get going?
It sounds right.
Smile on your face.
Yeah. Anecdotally, I can resonate with that. That anytime I've felt any one of those emotional states, it was usually when an individual or a circumstance has been misaligned to my expectation of their words, actions, or the outcome. Interested to go deeper and to find out more about sort of how you break this down and how we can become more aware of those emotional states ahead of time.
So how to get more aware of those emotional states? Let's actually fast track a little bit. So we want to become aware of these emotional states when it's still a small reaction, not a giant blowout. That's the first thing. Once someone's extremely angry, it's very hard to cool them down. When someone is just a little bit not happy with the situation, that's when it's pretty easy to get things back into a calm, neutral state, right? So the goal here is to be able to recognize when are we starting to get amped up. Because a lot of times we don't recognize how agitated or frustrated we are until we're legitimately very angry and very frustrated. Now, I think before we get to the tactics of how to actually do this, there's one big kind of principle here that usually people don't give themselves permission to recognize that they're getting frustrated or angry. There's this weird little permission line. If only if things get this bad, then I will speak out. Like only if the food at the restaurant is this bad, will I tell the waiter, hey, can you go change this? Like it's completely undercooked. This chicken is raw. And because of that, and I think this is a big part of how we're perhaps raised or how society is, of don't make a big deal out of that, just be okay with it, whatever it may be. Even if there's a lot of good insight from saying don't make a big deal out of everything, it also takes away your ability to recognize when things start to bother you a little bit, because you're basically trained to only be aware of it once it is a really, really big deal. Does that, first off, make sense, or is that a bit confusing?
It makes sense. How to have a toolkit to consistently deploy that thinking. That's what I'd be interested to learn from your insights as to how would I practically, I guess, habitualize that process.
It's a great question. So first off, I think it's just that awareness. A lot of times we're not aware that our wiring is that we only give ourselves permission to speak up against something or to course correct unless it's gotten to this severity. A lot of times when I have this conversation with people, like, I didn't recognize that I don't give myself permission to speak up or to say something's wrong unless it's really that bad. So first off, just that awareness that you don't have to wait until it's that bad to bring up a point of something that's frustrating. That's one. Now, to get out how to place it, so there's something that we've talked about a couple of times in the episodes, the ABC triangle. The whole understanding, how do you know what are the signs, the tells that you're starting to get emotionally reactive? And we talk about like A is affect. So how do I feel? I feel a bit uncomfortable. I feel a bit agitated. I feel a bit frustrated. I feel a bit unheard or confused, whatever it may be. B is body cognitive. So what happens to me physically when I'm starting to feel anger or I'm starting to feel frustration? So for some people, it's their chest feels a little tight. For some people, they feel like their neck stiffening, their jaw clenching, cracking knuckles. For stuff like me, I sometimes like I clench my jaw and I flare my nostrils. It's a very kind of more aggressive vibe. So what is that for you? And where do those things rank? And this is the big thing. So I had one client that we worked through his behavioral things. And one of them, for example, was typing really loud on the keyboard. Another one was slamming the drawers in his desk out of frustration. And another one was that he felt that he would just kind of like flick his nails a little bit. And we said, okay, like what happens first? And then how does it increase? He said, okay, first I'll just play with my like nails a little bit. And when it's something's not big of a deal, but I'm just a little bit bothered. Then I noticed if it's starting to agitate me even more, I recognize that I start typing harder on the keyboard. And only when I'm really pissed, I start slamming the drawers when I get something, or I slam the doors when I leave the office. So we said, okay, from now on, your goal is that as soon as you notice you starting to pick your fingernails or whatever it may be, you stop and you say, what's not adding up in my head? Why am I frustrated? And that's the way to do that, is by recognizing what are the early onset warning signs. That's how you can catch it early. And I'm sure like we have in a restaurant, for example, when the food isn't great, there's a voice in our head where we think to ourselves, should I bring this up? Is this worth bringing up? This isn't good, whatever it may be. And that's just an example of it. Is that helpful to think about it in that term?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. Right. So that's point number one. Just recognize that anger and frustration, they're an expectation alarm. And if you can view it and just reframe this emotion instead of saying like, why am I so mad? To get curious and say what expectation is not getting met, you could change a lot of it. Because again, you go from a more childish, I'm just angry perspective to a more curious adult. Like, what is going on here? And you get to learn something about yourself. So
in your experience, have your clients been able to provide like clear responses to that question? I'm wondering what
the expectation is.
Yeah, so for the entrepreneur is like, I'm really frustrated, angry. You said, great. What was the expectation? Go, I don't know. I don't know what my expectation was, but whatever I got wasn't it.
Yeah. So it'll lead into the second point, but okay. I think it's a big part of it, that we're not aware of our expectations or what we want it to happen. And that is a big part of it. Sometimes we're not aware of it consciously. So you'll ask someone, what was your expectation? And they'll pause. I guess it was this or that. Okay, yeah, that's what it was. That's why I was frustrated. And sometimes they'll just be like, I don't really know. Yeah. And that's when they have a very unfair expectation of someone else because they didn't even understand what they wanted and what would be required in order to hold up an agreement like that or whatever. So it kind of goes both ways, but it's a great question.
Yeah.
Now,
I
kind of
found
leading
that
into that
helpful.
point. Sorry, go ahead.
I found that helpful for either myself or with business partners, etc. Is if we can't answer that question, it can almost become comical because you can almost look back, like externalize it and say, my zero expectation outcome from this, and therefore zero game plan to engineer said outcome. It turns out that the magic didn't magically happen. And now I feel angry and upset. So going
It's like a
forwards,
childish reaction.
yeah,
I'm angry
exactly.
right now. Nobody understood what I didn't understand I want, and I'm angry, therefore.
100%.
I did not have my nap. I'm cranky. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads you to the second point. So I was a part of a conversation where people were talking about tracking remote employees' time, and if that's impactful or not impactful. And then one guy said something very, very wise, I think. He said, this is the same issue that people have as when they come into the workspace. We're just using time as an adjacent proxy to outcomes. Now, the reality is that really clarifying what are the outcomes we expect from each employee is hard because we're sometimes not clear on it. We don't know how to articulate it. So it's very challenging. So because it's challenging, we don't do that. And we just use time as a proxy for output. And he basically made a really good point that setting standards and creating agreements is hard. And that's why a lot of times we just avoid that. And we just have an expectation that people will try their best and do good. And when you can't measure something, you can't hold it. And expectations without standards, they're just destined for disappointment. So I think that's the next big thing about the expectations. That just recognizing that setting clear expectations and then turning them into agreements is hard. And a lot of times we're frustrated, but we've created the conditions that we're going to get frustrated in because we didn't do that hard upfront work. And again, while it's easy to be childish about it and just get angry and frustrated and say people should do better, it's not really valid if we haven't made the effort, which again is challenging, to clarify the standards and turn them into agreements.
Do you think it's difficult to clarify those standards because it could be perceived as being confrontational?
It's a great question. Probably, and I'm assuming that if you're asking it, there's some, like, why do you think that?
Because in my experience, I think I've improved my ability to like I selected better words, my tonality's improved, but I do have this sense in those conversations that when I'm saying, great, what does success look like? How would I measure that through numbers? What's an appropriate timeline? What would be the appropriate consequences for this outcome not being generated?
Yeah.
It's putting a lot of pressure because it's asking, I believe, the most meaningful questions from the individual who's responsible for doing that thing. And it's a challenging conversation, but the benefit has been that we're massively aligned on on all those variables. And should things not go according to plan, now I don't need to come in like the angry boss with steam coming out of his ears, rant and rave, and essentially have the other person feel like that the boss is mean or it's personal. It's you defined this as being the win. You said that these were going to be the actions. You did this and this and this, and it hasn't played out. So how are you going to solve it? It's not necessarily sort of giving them enough rope to hang themselves. It's putting the other person, I believe, in the architect's chair and saying, I'm going to help like sort of coach you through this process. You're going to be the person responsible for achieving it.
Yeah.
A
sense of ownership that it's not just put on them, but they get to figure it out themselves.
Yeah. But it does take a certain appetite for hard conversations up front.
Yeah.
And any time in my business where that hasn't played out, someone in a management position, etc., usually we can go back to the top of the stream and say, did you set this expectation, this, and this, and this? They gloss over those things, in which case I think that the non-performance was almost guaranteed.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think you made a really, really good point there that having these conversations and holding this is very emotionally uncomfortable. So to kind of give an example of something I recently heard, it was a divorce lawyer, and he was talking about prenups, and he was saying that the reason most marriages end are twofold. One, people don't understand what they want. 2, they don't know how to articulate what they want. And the other person doesn't understand. And what he was saying on top of it is that, surprisingly, when people have prenups, they have, like, the people in the pool, again, the data he used in the US, that have prenups have a much lower divorce rate than those who don't have prenups. And he was saying the reason is because they've basically taken the time to say, this is what we expect from each other. Everybody okay with this? Now, again, that obviously also probably stops certain marriages from happening that shouldn't have been happening. But once that expectation is there, it's clear. And again, this is for business as well. It could stop you from hiring an employee that's not right for you. But having a prenup, talking to a loved one and saying that is extremely uncomfortable. And that's why a lot of people avoid it. But just, he said, that process of being the kind of person who's willing to do that in order to get that kind of clarity, just that probably puts you in a place where you're less likely to get divorced, because you guys are clear on what each other wants and you've articulated in a manner that the other person can understand, with consequences, with everything. And I think what you made is a really great point that I wasn't actually planning on talking about, but that these tools don't matter if you're not willing to also accept the emotional discomfort that comes while applying them. That's a great point, man.
One internal tool I've been trying to use for myself is looking at decisions on a micro basis as, is this an investment or a tax? Whilst the conversation might be difficult right now, even if I'm using gut feel, in my gut, is this painful conversation now likely to improve X, Y, and Z? If that's the case, then I'm making an investment. But if I once I'm aware of that, if I choose to not have that conversation, I just commit to paying a tax. To what significance and when it occurs, I don't know, but I know it will happen. It will likely sort of snowball and come back at an inopportune time and at a higher significance that I prefer. So the second I can have that sort of left or right decision-making matrix, once I'm aware of it, is this is this necessary or beneficial? Yes. Then I'll make the investment and avoid paying the tax.
It's a great it's a great toolkit, man.
Right.
It's great.
Thank you.
Cool. So now let's kind of go into that 3-pronged choice of when you're in a situation that you recognize my expectation did get met. We created an agreement. I tried to do this, do the right way. I was willing to make that investment, but it's still not paying off. So this is something that we talked about in that email in the newsletter, and a couple of people responded specifically about this. So I want to elaborate a little bit. Basically 3 things. And again, this is not my invention. Change it, leave it, or accept it. Every frustration you have probably lives in one of these 3 buckets. Okay, you can fix it, you can walk away, or you can recalibrate your expectation. So the first thing is, if the situation bothers you and you can change it, great. When there's a clear path to improvement, whether it's training, conversation, clarifying the standard to an even better level, because it was just an expectation. That's why I'm angry, that's why I'm frustrated, but now I need to clarify a standard and have that agreed upon. Great, you can change it. Hope is not lost. It was just something about the strategy that's not right. If you recognize that the cost of trying to fix this outweighs the actual benefit, maybe you can leave it. Or if it's just not fixable, you're saying the other party is just completely not willing to budge, or if they're willing to budge, but it's going to cost too much, I don't want to have to train this person from zero or to try to change their personality, you can leave it. Or there's certain situations where even though you're frustrated, and I think this is the hard one, you still have to accept it. Because you can say logically, I know this thing about this relationship, I don't like it, but in the overall level, it still delivers more value than the friction it creates. And this is like something we've talked about in previous episodes, that no one's perfect, no employee, no spouse, no friend. But if I can say, on the aggregate, they're still really great. And this is just a part of who they are that I am probably not going to change or create change in. And I'm still, and overall, happy with it. Then I got to accept it. And there's going to be certain points where that frustrates me. But the less I accept it, the more it's going to frustrate me.
To add a little bit of color to that, I think that if we choose to accept the status quo, whether it's a dynamic or it's a performance metric, I would think that true acceptance means you no longer punish yourself with the emotional reactions to that non-performance or the challenging conflict. Because I've had
What do you mean by punish
untold.
yourself?
So if I use dynamics as the example, I've had plenty of conversations with entrepreneurs where they've got someone who's not doing the right things or in the right way or whatever. They've got a non-performing staff member that they'll complain about a lot, but they have not obviously done the change aspects. So they haven't either decided to
They
level
haven't
up or
tried to
level
invest
out.
in it, in your words.
Yes, they might have left it, but they didn't accept it. So it's kind of like they're saying, a decision to do nothing is still a decision, and that if you choose to do nothing, then it's going to remain the same or deteriorate. And if you're causing yourself internal conflict because frustration, anger about this non-performing employee, to remind yourself, no, I chose to do nothing. I chose to accept this. And so if I'm going to accept it, suffering the emotional state as well as a non-performance is like a double whammy. So I may as well just accept the poor performance or ship the person out. But I've just found a lot of entrepreneurs stuck in this sort of
In between.
vortex,
Yeah.
yes, of frustrated and angry about the individual, yet not willing to take it to that next level in order to actually get a change. And so they're just kind of stuck in this. Yes.
I want to bring that back to the very first thing we said about the permission line. And that's a big part about what it is, that we think we have to like change it or leave it once it gets to a certain level of bad, of frustrating or angry. And it's kind of like the most dangerous place is the gray area, right? Where you don't have to do something. For example, if you don't corner a wounded animal, because then they will react. And it's kind of the same thing internally. We all have that little bit of mechanism. When things aren't that bad, we'll just kind of let it happen. That's when we'll die by 1,000 paper cuts.
Yes.
But when we just give ourselves permission to act much quicker. And as soon as something pings a little bit, like we just get like my client, that little fingernail twitching, whatever it may be, then you say, okay, immediately, what bucket is this? Do I got to accept it? Do I got to change it? Do I got to leave it? What's going on here? Because a lot of times, like you're saying, that vortex, I think that vortex really just exists beneath that permission line. When something starts to frustrate us, but we don't really give ourselves permission to address it.
Yeah.
It's like I had this actually with one of my 9-figure guys, very successful guy. And he also recognized like there's a lot of things he told himself the story about. Like, it's just part of being the big boss. When someone makes an offhanded comment, just ignore it, move on. But he didn't realize that it was draining a little bit of his bandwidth every time because it was annoying him a little bit. And him just taking that one person aside and being like, hey, man, like these conversations, don't do that. That 3-minute conversation that he did it in a very nice way, very cordial way. The employee fully understood and was like, ah, crap, I didn't realize that it was taken that way. Or like other people might perceive it as disrespect to your authority, whatever it may be. I'm very sorry. Cleared all that up. Just because he gave himself, he lowered his permission line. That he was like, I'm not going to just accept it. I'm going to change it. Because he didn't really accept it. It was just kind of like bothering him. Does this kind of make sense?
It does. And I've got a question regarding sort of if I look at this internally. So if I can increase my ability to be aware what actions to take and develop some tactics along the way, that's I believe is all sort of internal work that I can level myself up. But externally, what causes what are the circumstances in what combination that are likely to lead to anger and frustration is completely different for every single person. And so if a person A could have hugely consequential situations going on where they are the key decision maker and be operating in a perfectly stoic state, no stress or none of these negative emotional states, somebody else could be having a very low level discussion about something inconsequential and be like redlining in terms of anger and frustration. Do you think that the more we do the internal work at upskilling our mindset and developing the skills or the capabilities to then have the confidence to have those conversations or be clearer in our communication, that we tend to raise the threshold for what external circumstances cause us to feel that emotional state? you think there's a correlation between the internal work and then what external things are more likely to cause that?
Absolutely. I think it's just like physical training.
Right.
Same thing with your mind. You learn to
Right.
take on bigger challenges, you get accustomed to it, you just move on. Absolutely.
And
And
so
just
when you
like
look at
physical stuff, there's, sorry, just to add to that, but just like
Sure.
the physical component, there's also momentary regressions. If you're underslept, if you don't eat, if you have a lot of stress going on. And it's just to be aware of that. Of what's going on with me? How can I modulate myself so I can get better performance?
Right. And so using the athletic analogy, in the same way that there's some people that run a marathon every day for 100 days straight or some sort of crazy endeavor, there's also entrepreneurs who can be out at dinner, having a great time, making jokes in the life of the party, knowing that the next morning they're appearing in front of Congress, and they've just developed this skill set over time to separate what's going on versus their emotional states. And so the more that I think we can do this little work as we try to level up in business, the greater our ability to not be forced into those emotional states.
Yeah, I think one of the more how would I call it? The more spiritual arena alumni that we've ever had. He, at one of the calls, he was like, Itamar, can I share a poem? And I was like, okay, if it's going to be quick, go for it. And he said, all right. So it goes like this. I walk down the street, I don't see the pothole, and I fall in it. The next day, I walk down the street, I see the pothole, and I still fall in it. The day after that, I walk down the street, I see the pothole, I avoid it. The final day, I just go down a different street. And I thought it was actually very good because it's very similar to what the stuff here is. We learn this as a skill. The first time we get really angry, we won't notice it. We'll start shoving, like slamming the drawers or the door, like my client did. The next time we're like, I'm recognizing that I'm starting to be a bit frustrated. We recognize I'm tapping really hard on the keyboards. Wait, why am I'm angry? What is there an expectation here? Let me figure that out. The next time after that, we notice ourselves playing with our fingernails and recognize, I always have this expectation about this or that. And I honestly haven't made my mind up if I'm going to change it, leave it, or accept it. Because I haven't given myself permission to say, you know what, this is bothering me a little bit, so I'm going to do something about it. And it's how we progress with this stuff. And it's a skill set that we build and we build and we build.
Well, that skill set, I'm assuming, is also relevant to the game we're playing at that point in time. And so if we've got a stoic outlook on our business, let's say you're generating $1 million a year in revenue or profit or whatever, and life is good. Should you launch a new thing, get traction in a certain area, and now that company goes from doing $1 million a year in revenue to 10 million or $100 million in revenue, then likely the org structure, the risks has amplified by a similar or higher degree. And so whilst we might have had a stoic outlook on business at one point in time, if we find ourselves feeling anger, frustration, negative emotional states, it might also be a signal that we no longer have the skills relevant to the new game that we're now playing.
Yeah.
Do you think that's accurate or fair?
I think it's accurate. I said we're also not used to dealing with different kinds of pressure. For example, in the previous episode, we talked about I know how to avoid that pothole of me feeling uncomfortable about my decisions. I have not yet learned how to avoid that pothole about me not feeling comfortable with investor money and how to use that. So it's just about different kinds of ways where it's trying to attack our psychological psyche and our calm.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
It does, because I think that there's a similar formula here where you look at business, sports, special operations that are at the top of town in any of these arenas. As you get closer and closer to whatever that apex performance looks like, usually as you enter those arenas, everyone is feeling grossly unqualified to be there. And it's a fight every day to maintain certain performance. So if that's what true excellence looks like, of just a never-ending cycle of feeling inadequate and just striving to improve every single day, being aware of that emotional cost of entry as you level up those different tiers, I think might be helpful to be able to avoid the feeling of, I felt calm in the past, everything was good, why am I freaking out now?
Yeah. And again, I think I'll go back to this, and I see that we have a bit of different perspectives here, which is great. I think one of the The biggest inhibitor, perhaps, is again that permission line. That when I'm operating in a new level, I'm supposed to be this, I'm supposed to be this calm CEO, so I should just let this slide or that slide. And again, it's an example from a 9-figure guy. I should just let this slide, even though why would you? Why would you let someone undermine your authority, even if it's just in a joking way?
Mm-hmm.
And I can share the story where I learned about this permission line. Actually, had nothing to do with business. It was in jiu-jitsu. And it was at a tournament in Rio de Janeiro. And I think it was the semifinals or finals, I don't remember. And I was down on points, and there was like a minute left. This was when I was a blue belt. And the guy had me in side control, which for anyone who doesn't know jiu-jitsu, it's basically if you're down on points and you're in that situation, it's pretty hard to move if there's a minute left because they can kind of stall out the clock. And I remember in my head thinking like, oh man, I don't know if I'm going to be able to like win this match. I might have to like, I think I might lose. And then he went and did Neon Belly. Neon Belly is a technique that can be seen in jiu-jitsu circles as a more demeaning technique. It's like me trying to like really assert like, I am above you. And I remember when that happened, I got pissed off and I was like, F you. And I immediately was able to like burst out of it. I ended up getting on top and actually choking him and winning the match. And afterwards, I was like, huh, interesting. If he wouldn't have pushed me like that, like emotionally, and pissed me off, I might have not reacted and won. And it was something that I later employed when I'm on the offensive in jiu-jitsu. I try not to take a whole foot from someone. I just try to like inch by inch, make them secede small little things because people are willing to give that up. It's a little psychological tool. Like they're not going to give you everything, but if you just slowly take a little bit, like that 1,000 paper cuts way, people will secede. And I think it's just part of human nature. And it's something that I'm conscious about myself. And I think everybody else would benefit as well to recognize where am I not giving myself permission? Because it's a small thing, but it adds up. So like, again, that permission line can be at 0. Mm. As soon as something is starting to frustrate you, you say, wait. Change it, leave it, accept it. What do I want to choose here? What do I want to do about it? Onwards. I don't have to wait in that vortex of frustration like you called it because maybe this isn't a big deal. Let's just gloss over it.
Makes a lot of sense.
Cool. And finally, to wrap up all this in a bow, none of this stuff I think that we talked about is going to be very impactful for you. If you don't, this is like the biggest tip, the biggest hack for anger and frustration is work out consistently. I look at some entrepreneurs that never exercise and they're just playing life on hard mode. Like biologically, you're just not releasing all those things. We talk a lot about doing the preemptive work to prepare yourself for hardship, just working out. It's hard to really get angry and frustrated after you've had a hard workout. It's challenging to do that. You kind of get out your testosterone, whatever it may be. And if you're listening to this podcast and all the stuff resonated with you, but you're not working out, recognize it's actually probably the first thing to do. And also a lot of times when you're feeling yourself in that vortex of frustration, like you called it, Alex, and you find yourself not willing to make the investment and you're paying too much taxes, whatever it may be, just go for a workout. It can clarify your thinking so much, and it's just one of those ultimate hacks.
Totally agree. I think the physical state is often the catalyst for a change in psychological state. It's very easy to do. There's no barrier. You can do burpees at home, you go for a walk, whatever it is, but changing the physical state, burning some energy. The amount of times where I've had something which was a level 11 problem in my head prior to going for a workout, coming away from the workout, whatever you're doing, suddenly you realize it's a level 1 problem, or that there's obvious solutions to it that you weren't able to see because you were in that heightened emotional state prior to it.
Yeah, 100%. So this is what I want to leave with everyone today. Ask yourself this. What in life is causing you a lot of frustration or anger? Okay? Think about that subject. Then, like Alex said, go for a workout. Then ask yourself, if I gave myself permission to address it, regardless if it feels small or like not a big deal, but I actually gave myself permission to address it and I accepted that this investment that I'm making into it is going to be a bit uncomfortable. It's going to be emotionally challenging. What would I tell myself? Hey, this is where you need to change it. You need to accept it, or you need to leave it. if you can follow that process, you can turn anger and frustration into something that's actually productive as a trigger. Say, one of my expectations isn't met. This is an alarm. So how can I solve that? And on that note, we'll leave you guys today. Have a good rest of your week.